Welcome. I'm glad you're here at Intersections. Intersections is a monthly luncheon put on by Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, working in conjunction with our steering committee here in Cedar Rapids. And we hold Intersections on the first Friday of each month from September to June. And very glad that you have joined us today. And if you're new to us, a special welcome to you, and hope that you will return. On your table, you can see there are flyers for our next event, and so if you want to take those with you and put up somewhere publicly, that would be wonderful. We would love to have more folks in the room. So next month, we are very pleased and honored to have Chief Justice Mark Cady from the Iowa Supreme Court, and he's going to be talking about fair and impartial courts. He's a good friend to Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. We have worked with him on a number of fair courts issues, and are pleased that he accepted our invitation to speak. Also on the table, you will see a postcard size paper that has the full year, and we are pleased to be able to do that. And hopefully you'll take that home, put it on your refrigerator so that you know what's coming up next. Or even better, hand it to a friend so that they know about Intersections and can look forward to our upcoming speakers. The steering committee did some wonderful work this summer in making sure that we had our speakers lined up for the year. You'll see, with the exception of May, still working on that. But we want to make sure that you have that information, and please do invite others to attend these events. I think they're well worth attending, and I don't know about you, but I always learn something every single time, and so I hope that others can join us for that as well. At the core of what Intersections is really civil dialogue, and how to have civil dialogue on important issues that impact us and our society. So I think we are achieving that, and particularly today as we talk about climate change and the Pope's Encyclical. And so without further ado, I will introduce to you our speaker today. Bill Mulcahey taught in the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department at Mount Mercy University, Cedar Rapids. He is taught in the Archdiocesan, correct? I obviously am not Catholic, lay formation program classes. Before moving to Cedar Rapids in 2002, Bill and his family lived in Central and South America for 15 years, where he divided his time working in and forming You're going to have to say that for me. What he said, and he'll say it for you again. Basic Christian communities, and teaching and serving as an administrator in universities and seminaries in Panama, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. He resides in Cedar Rapids with his Panamanian wife, Damaris, and their two daughters, Shannon and Maureen, who were born in Ecuador. Will you help me welcome Bill, please?
Can you hear me from here? Oh, okay, great. That was a nice introduction. I didn't realize all that background was going to be thrown in there. It's a little bit scary being here, although I'm very happy and very pleased to have been invited to address you for this month's meeting of Intersections, probing the overlap of religion and politics. I said I'm a little bit embarrassed because I know half of you people here, and after the talk is over, I thought I was just going to be able to slink out of here and go away and nobody would know me ever again. But unfortunately, there's all of you people here this afternoon. But I think that's great. It's wonderful to have you here, and I'm very happy to be here. And as you know, today's session, as mentioned, is taking a look at Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change. Now, in case I never get around to it, I want to give you the 4 main points of the encyclical right at the beginning, so that with all the other verbiage that's going to pour out from me, you don't get lost, okay? So I'm going to give you how Cardinal Peter Turkson, who is really the architect of the encyclical Laudato Si, that comes out under the name of Pope Francis. Okay, this is the way that he summarized the main points of the encyclical just a week ago at Boston College, after Pope Francis had returned to Rome. okay? Boston College had a seminar for 3 days on Laudato Si, and Cardinal Peter Turkson had been invited to give the keynote talk. And luckily, he said, here are the main points. So I will tell you what he said. First of all, humanity is not separate from the environment in which we live. Rather, humanity and the natural environment are one. Second point, the accelerating change in climate is undeniable, catastrophic, and worsened by human activities. But it is also amenable to human intervention. So there's hope. The grave errors that underlie our disastrous indifference to the environment include a throwaway culture of consumerism and a naive confidence that technological advances and undirected commercial markets will inevitably and automatically solve our environmental problems. Now, the twofold crisis. The crises are basically human sustainability and environmental sustainability. The twofold crisis can be overcome, not by more of the same, but through changes arising from generous dialogue and fundamental ethical and indeed spiritual decision-making at every level. So if you don't get anything else from this talk, please try to hang on to that. First of all, some background information for many of you who might not know some of the terminology that's involved here. First of all, the word encyclical. Well, it's a letter written by the Pope, and it's sent to the whole church, meaning the Catholic Church, and at times, as is the case with Laudato Si, beyond the church to the whole world. An encyclical is commonly focused on church teaching regarding a particular issue or currently important matter. The title of an encyclical, as in this case Laudato Si, is taken from the opening words of the letter. Now, the encyclical is called Laudato Si, and that's medieval Central Italian for praise be to you. It comes from St. Francis of Assisi's 13th century Canticle of the Sun, also called the Canticle of the Creatures, a poem and prayer in which God is praised for the creation of the different creatures and aspects of the earth. Now, the encyclical letter has a subtitle, On Care for Our Common Home. Cardinal Turkson makes note of this. He says the following: the very subtitle of the encyclical, On Care for Our Common Home, conveys an important conviction. Individual homes are not isolated, each on its own planet. They are located in a single, worldwide, common home. The encyclical is about the implications of living together in a common home. Laudato Si is an invitation to dialogue. That means everybody is invited to join in the conversation. In chapter 5 of the encyclical is called Lines of Approach and Action. Pope Francis outlines the major paths of dialogue which can help us escape the spiral of self-destruction which currently engulfs us. He lists dialogue on the environment in the international community, dialogue for national and local policies, dialogue and transparency in decision-making, politics and economy in dialogue for human fulfillment, and finally, religions in dialogue with science. If there has ever been a pope of dialogue, it is Francis. He writes in Article 201 of the Encyclical, "The gravity of the ecological crisis demands that we all look to the common good, embarking on a path of dialogue which demands patience, self-discipline, and generosity, always keeping in mind that realities are greater than ideas." That's taken from The Joy of the Gospel, one of the first publications that came from the hand of Pope Francis. Realities are greater than ideas. Let's not talk in the air. Let's get our feet on the ground. To enter into dialogue is not the same thing as to decree from on high a particular course of action. Laudato Si is an ethically nuanced, often gripping analysis of our contemporary moral and environmental predicaments, and an invitation to articulate and embrace an ecological humanism worthy of our best efforts. I think the world discovered something when Pope Francis was elected Pope. They saw something new was going to happen. And how did they know that? Right away, by the choice of the name Francis. And that is so important in our understanding anything about Pope Francis himself and Laudato Si. Laudato Si mi Signore. Praise be to you, my Lord. These words at the outset of St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures call to mind that the earth, our common home, is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. As the encyclical affirms, St. Francis is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology. Remember that word, an integral ecology, lived out joyfully and authentically. He shows us, St. Francis shows us just how inseparable is the bond between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. Perhaps some of you had the opportunity to listen to Pope Francis just a week ago today when he delivered a speech before the General Assembly of the United Nations. Here's a part of how USA Today reported on that event just hours after the Pope's discourse, quoting Francis as follows. These are things that you can find also in the encyclical. Francis says, "We human beings are part of the environment. We live in communion with it, since the environment itself entails ethical limits which human activity must acknowledge and respect. Any harm done to the environment, therefore, is harm done to humanity." He goes on, environmental destruction goes hand in hand with injustice and is a result of a system that is too focused on material wealth. A selfish and boundless thirst for power and material prosperity that misuses natural resources and degrades the environment also leads to social ills by excluding those who are physically, economically, or politically weak. Economic and social exclusion is a complete denial of human fraternity and a grave offense against human rights and the environment. Those are powerful statements that reflect the tenor of Laudato Si as well. So let me please stop here for a moment to offer a couple of reflections on what I just read to you. First of all, later on, I'll illustrate how the tenor of Pope Francis's remarks go way beyond the issue of climate change, even climate change caused by human activity. There is no doubt, however, as to where Pope Francis stands on the issue of climate change and the intersection of religion and politics, which is what we're talking about here at Intersections, okay? This is what the Pope says in Article 23 of Laudato Si. A very solid scientific consensus indicates that we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. A number of scientific studies indicate that most global warming in recent decades is due to the great concentration of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxides, and others that are released mainly as a result of human activity. Human-induced climate change is a positive fact in Pope Francis's Anthology of Environment. Many would acknowledge that the Pope's stance is both political as well as scientific. A question has been raised by some, even by certain Catholics. Is this stance one that a religious leader should expound upon? For years, I have been a follower of Sojourners, the progressive evangelical social justice organization headed up by Jim Wallace. In one of my courses at Mount Mercy called Christians Divided, now it's not Protestants against Catholics, it's conservatives versus liberal battles. My students have read Wallace's God's Politics and On God's Side. I constantly repeat the mantra, God, like faith, is always personal, but never private. I think Pope Francis would agree. My second reflection is this. Pope Francis is advocating what he calls an integral ecology. Peter Turkson has this to say. Midway through Laudato Si, we find this question raised by Francis. What kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? Francis continues, this answer does not have to do with the environment alone and in isolation. The issue cannot be approached piecemeal. This leads us to ask ourselves about the meaning of existence and its values that are at the basis of social life. So we're branching out beyond man-made climate change. We are branching out beyond simply the environment, but we're looking at a whole picture that involves not only environmental sustainability, but human sustainability. Pope Francis says, all of this leads us to ask about the meaning of existence, as I said, and its values that are the basis of social life. What is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and all our efforts? What need does the earth have of us? If we do not ask these basic questions, says Francis, it is no longer enough, then, simply to state that we should be concerned for future generations. Oh, we can all say that, but there's an awful lot that has to be asked before we can say we have really done that. What Pope Francis is describing in Laudato Si is an integral ecology. Integral ecology stands at the heart of Pope Francis's teaching in this letter. It is mentioned at least 10 times, and it is the title of chapter 4 of the letter itself. It is his way of asserting that the environmental crisis is not only about polluted land, water, and air, but includes dangerous attitudes towards other human beings, as well as economic practices that harm people and the environment. Integral ecology, for Francis, means an attention to the necessary interaction and wholeness of relationships. Creation care implies relationship. A new word that has been coined is perhaps companionship with the physical environment around us. With God being part of the relationship, with other people, with creation, and with ourselves. His profound respect for vulnerable life finds articulation in Article 117. When we fail to acknowledge, as part of reality, the worth of a poor person, a human embryo, a person with disabilities, to offer just a few examples, it becomes difficult to hear the cry of nature itself. Everything is connected. Everything is connected, he says again. But population per se is not the main cause of environmental degradation, says Francis. Instead, a more complex metric is necessary, one that looks at disordered human habits of human beings and societies. This is an ecology which respects our unique place as human beings in this world and our relationship to our surroundings. In fact, nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. So those are some introductory concepts that I wanted to get across, first of all, okay? Now what I'd like to do is go through, I'm not going to read you the whole encyclical, it's 120 pages long, okay? But what I'd like to do is give you a brief concept of what each chapter of the encyclical is about. It consists of 6 chapters. So what I'm going to do is read something from Pope Francis's letter and give you a little bit of commentary about it. And the commentary is, some of it is mine, but most of it is from people who are much better suited to be talking about this, and all the people that I consulted in doing research for this talk, okay? So, Francis says in Article 15 of Laudato Si', he says this: "It is my hope that this encyclical letter, which is now added to the body of the Church's social teaching, can help us to acknowledge the appeal, immensity, and urgency of the challenge we face." Now, in referring to chapter 1, I will begin, he says, by briefly renewing several aspects of the present ecological crisis with the aim of drawing on the results of the best scientific research available today, letting them touch us deeply and provide a concrete foundation for the ethical and spiritual itinerary that follows. So what's going on right now in the world? So chapter 1, entitled, "What is Happening to Our Common Home?" admits of several answers that we can summarize perhaps this way. We are degrading our common home, especially through pollution and climate change, deterioration and overuse of water, loss of biodiversity, and the breakdown of society through global inequality, among other signs. It is here in Article 21 that we hear one of the letter's most memorable comments. Pope Francis says, "The earth, our home, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth." Strong words. Francis claims that these problems are both spiritual and structural. The rest of the encyclical unpacks this notion by way of a number of themes which will reappear as the letter unfolds. Okay, I'm going to give you a kind of a list of those themes because they don't just come at one place. They repeat it in every chapter, but with a different focus each time he's dealing with a new chapter. Okay, the examples of the number of themes goes like this. The intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. The conviction that everything in the world is connected. The critique of new paradigms and forms of power derived from technology. The call to seek other ways of understanding the economy and progress. The value proper to each creature. The human meaning of ecology. The need for forthright and honest debate. The serious responsibility of international and local policy. He also mentions the throwaway culture and the proposal of a new lifestyle. In referring to chapter 2, Francis continues, I will then consider some principles drawn from the Judeo-Christian tradition which can render our commitment to the environment more coherent. So in chapter 2, which is entitled The Gospel of Creation, Francis turns to biblical sources to illuminate the mandate to care for creation as a fundamental tenet of faith, defined in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as stewardship. It is this perspective on responsibility to God and to creation that modern human beings have forgotten, says Francis. Francis points out that creation itself reveals God. The goods of the earth are not meant for abuse and exploitation, but rather for sharing and for inclusiveness of the least among us. The biblical narratives, he says, demonstrate the truth that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. The harmony between the Creator, humanity, and creation as a whole was disrupted by our presuming to take the place of God and refusing to acknowledge our creaturely limitations. I think we remember that story, don't we? Okay. Moreover, the natural environment is a collective good, not something to be held privately or exclusively for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many, now or in the future. Referring to chapter 3, the Pope continues, I will then attempt to get to the roots of the present situation, so as to consider not only its symptoms, but also its deepest causes. Hold on to your hats. Chapter 3, the human roots of the ecological crisis, is Francis's most sustained critique of contemporary humanity's values and practices. It is humanity's outsized technological and economic domination over the planet's natural beauty that is at the root of many social and environmental ills. The rapid rise of human technology and economic prowess outpaces evolution, and our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. Francis calls upon all of us to consider and then constrain technological and economic ideologies, or what he calls the technocratic paradigm, in which technology, efficiency, and profit are seen as ends in themselves. The technological paradigm, he says, ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups. In chapter 4, Francis writes, considering the deepest causes of our present situation will help to provide an approach to ecology which respects our unique place as human beings in this world and our relationship to our surroundings. So in chapter 4, Integral Ecology, Francis describes what is needed for us to move forward in a bold cultural revolution. Nobody is suggesting a return to the Stone Age, he says, but we do need to slow down and take a look at reality in a different way, to appropriate the positive and sustainable progress which has been made, but also to recover the values and the great goals swept away by our unrestrained delusions of grandeur. An integral ecology challenges all people to broaden their focus of concern and their daily behavior to include standard environmental ecology, of course, but also protection of all human life, concrete acts of solidarity with the poor, the common good extending to future generations, the value of human labor, serene harmony with nature, simple daily gestures which break with the logic of violence and exploitation and selfishness. I have a list of Francis's 10 ecological commandments that would never be denied place in any courthouse in the United States. Other things that are part of integral ecology are ethical conduct in economic affairs, greater attention to urban planning to facilitate social relationships and give all people some contact with nature, protection of people's cultural heritage in an era when media saturation tends to erase distinctions. It also includes a contemplative outlook, one that reflects deeply on ecological decisions. Earlier, in one of the strongest paragraphs in the entire encyclical, Francis identifies the current problem as having to do with humans' misguided and hyperconsumptive habits. These reveal the implicit assumption that we can technologically and economically dominate each other and the natural world. The same logic that leads to the sexual exploitation of children and abandonment of the elderly, he says, justifies buying the organs of the poor for resale or eliminating children because they are not what their parents wanted. This same use and throwaway logic generates so much waste because of the disordered desire to consume more than what is really necessary. So ecological and social ills are connected. We are faced not with two separate crises, he says at the start of chapter 4, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Any solution, he says, demands an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. Referring to chapter 5, Francis writes, in light of this reflection, I will advance some broader proposals for dialogue and action which would involve each of us as individuals and also affect international policy. I have a list of 10 virtues and a whole bunch of principles that he would like to talk about, and I'm not going to do it for you here, but I want to give you the tenor of what that chapter 5 is all about. So in chapter 5, lines of approach and action, Francis identifies contemporary mechanisms for attaining the common good, making mention of the 1992 Earth Summit at Rio de Janeiro and successful conventions on hazardous wastes, while also stating clearly that at present, with regard to climate change, the advances have been regrettably few. Reducing greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage, and responsibility, he says, above all on the part of those countries which are more powerful and pollute the most. Ooh, can't remember. Okay. And also, Francis really powerfully says this for all of us who are believers here. We believers, Francis admonishes, cannot fail to ask God for a positive outcome to the present discussions so that future generations will not have to suffer the effects of our ill-advised delays. Then, referring to chapter 6, Francis says, finally, convinced as I am that change is impossible without motivation and a process of education, I will offer some inspired guidelines for human development to be found in the treasure of Christian spiritual experience. So in chapter 6, ecological education and spirituality, the pastoral tone and spiritual content of the encyclical returns. Many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all, he says, who need to change. We lack an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and of a future to be shared with everyone. A great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal. This last and final chapter 6 is Francis's prognosis, his call to spiritual discernment, and where his distinctive pastoral style shines through most clearly. The need for ecological conversion or rebirth of moral perspective, an integral ecology that is also an authentic humanism. Above all, it is an invitation to consider how, after the abundant facts of environmental and social degradation, the ultimate question is what values we want to guide our lives. The rich heritage of Christian spirituality, the fruit of 20 centuries of personal and communal experience, has a precious contribution to make, he claims. But it is not simply Catholic spirituality and social teaching that Francis appeals to here. He draws heavily upon the teachings of ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew I, as well as the Muslim mystic Ali al-Khawass, and the non-religious Earth Charter, as he makes a series of points about humility, gratitude, patience, responsibility, and attentiveness. These are among the ecological virtues that are also part of attaining social and environmental justice now and in the future. Finally, what can we take away from Laudato Si? I recently came across an article on Laudato Si written by Rowan Williams, the Anglican prelate, theologian, and poet. He was Archbishop of Canterbury from 2002 to 2012. Here is one of his more sterling statements. Laudato Si repeatedly points us back to a fundamental lesson. We as human beings are not the source of meaning or value. If we believe we are, we exchange the real world for a virtual one, a world in which the only question is, who is to be master? A culture in which managing limits is an embarrassing and unwelcome imperative is a culture that has lost touch with the very idea of a world, let alone a created world. That is, one in which a creative intelligence communicates with us and leads us into meanings and visions we could not have generated ourselves. Well, thank you for your attention. That's all I have to say for now. I have tons of notes over here. I think the dynamic here is that we leave time open for remarks from the floor, questions and answers, but questions and answers are going to be thrown back at you because I am not an expert on many of these things, but I would like to hear what you folks might have to say and what your reactions to what you know now of Laudato Si might entail. So
if you'll raise your hand, and I'll bring the microphone to you so everyone can hear.
My first reaction is to know if we can have a copy of your notes and your speech as you...
Okay, I will. I can do that. I can send it to the folks here, and I'll just want to go through and make sure I attribute to everyone what's their due.
Thank you very much, sir.
So if you want that, after Bill is kind enough to send it to us, then just let us know and we'll email that to folks who actually want it.
Bill, I certainly applaud the Pope for his very thoughtful remarks on climate change, and I commending President Obama for his initiatives on climate change. I keep being haunted, however, by Joseph Stalin's snide question, how many legions, how many troops has the Pope? And can you foresee a day when Catholics, both at the grassroots level and the Catholic hierarchy, will lobby as vigorously on the issue of climate change as they do currently on issues like abortion and same-sex marriage, or will some issues be more equal than others?
I think we're seeing a situation of which there's more equality for everything than there's for few things. And I think we've all picked that up from our hearing of what Pope Francis is saying. It's not to say that the things that have been treated in the past are, left behind and no longer to be discussed. It's just that, we have to see the intersections, I think, between all of these realities. And, in this idea of an integral ecology is based on the idea that everything is connected. There are intersections between all of these moral issues. And what we need to do is develop a consistent ethic that can be used in dealing with. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be on board with every issue, but a consistent ethic asks us, I think, to look around and see the different problems that are facing us and look at the principles that stand behind it so that the consistency will be shown to be evident. I think the question of integral ecology is one of those in which Francis has, for many Catholics, opened up a door to saying that, salvation does not come just at the end of life. It doesn't come only through the preaching of Jesus, but that salvation is something that is taking place right here and now. It's kind of the idea that's behind what is called liberation theology. But amazingly, in the first page of a book that I brought along with me, in case I had to appeal to it, but Pope Francis referred to it. This is the compendium of social doctrine of the Catholic Church. And he said that his Laudato Si, is going to have to come out as an addendum to this particular thing. So what we're finding out here in the opening paragraphs of this document is that, yes, salvation needs to be taking place and to be evident here and now in the lives of people, and not only something at the end. Yes?
We have a question over here.
Bill, one difference I see between what the Pope is doing and what most politicians do is that the Pope is actually saying we have limits, we're going to have to sacrifice, we're going to have to stop doing some things, and politicians will not tell us this. There will always be more, or they tend to there'll be a technology that will save us, or, on the liberal side, it's, we look to the renewable energies, that those will allow us to continue to have our lifestyle. But what I hear the Pope saying is no, there are limits, and the sooner we learn those limits, the better off we'll be.
Mm-hmm. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom I cited at the end of the talk that I gave, and another part of his talk says, it's very evident that we have lost the sense of what the natural law is all about. Because we don't listen to the cry of nature, he says. The earth is crying out in desperation, and we're not hearing it because we go ahead with this unbounded confidence that we will be able to solve all problems without having to give up anything in the process. So I think one of the main questions here is, are people content with the idea that we are going to have to limit ourselves? Do we have what we might call an asceticism? That's a big word. Asceticism means self-discipline and carrying it over into the spiritual realm, It includes all of those virtues that I mentioned at the end there of patience, especially. Patience is needed in something like this. But all of the other things of gratitude. developing a sense of gratitude for the earth, the common home that we live in. I mean, if we did have a sense of gratitude rather than a rapacious attitude of ripping everything out of it, perhaps things might change. And so it comes back to there is a human ecology as well. Human beings are part of the creation, Francis says. We are not something separate from the creation. We need to see that the creation before us has its limits, and that we as human beings also have our limits, I think. Now, I could go on for hours, but I won't.
Bill, I appreciate that you've brought up the word limits. And as a student of the late Mary Alice Erickson at Coe, when I took her demography class, what was pounded into my head back in the day was ZPG, zero population growth, and the fact that this earth cannot possibly sustain the ever-burgeoning population. Now, I realize that that is totally contrary to Catholic teaching in terms of childbearing. And I'm just curious, I've not read the entire Laudato Si. Does the Pope address that conflict of overpopulation with no limit and how that affects the climate?
I'll give a couple of examples, Libby. First of all, I cited from in the talk that Pope Francis says that overpopulation per se is not the cause of our environmental ill, okay? Now notice, overpopulation per se, as if this is the one thing that if you get rid of this overpopulation problem, we are going to be having a solution to all the ills. But by saying overpopulation per se, I don't think Francis is excluding the question. And in fact, I don't know if you saw it on the news, but I lost a whole week I gained a tremendous experience in a week of my life last week, following practically every talk that Francis gave. But one of the more illuminating ones was on the return flight to Rome afterwards, and they asked him about that. And he said something to the effect of, family planning is good. Responsible family planning is even better. And so, there's a realistic attitude on his part. He's not turning his back at all on any of the other teachings of earlier popes on the question of the value of human life, or the idea that contraceptives are against human nature. He's not turning his back on that. And in fact, I think he's encouraging people to take a look at how they might be able to insert themselves into the solution of the problem, rather than just standing up and saying that, if the Catholic Church just weren't here, we'd be able to solve all of these things, or something like that. I don't know. But what I also want to say is that if you notice the context and the way in which Francis expresses these ideas, it sounds so pastoral. It sounds as if he wants you to be able to grow and to become more human and to become more spiritual in the face of God. It's all of these things that are, it's just not the words. Unfortunately, I would love to have him read that to us. It might take a few weeks, that long talk before Congress and everything. That was, it was a very short talk when you get down to it, because of the slowness with which he said things. But you got that sense that here is a bishop who is really taking care of his flock. Okay, and no matter if we don't agree with everything that he says it in a very nice way, okay, which probably for many folks is a little bit different from hearing things before, okay? So I agree with that. No problem with that one at all.
Bill, we're over here.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, this letter has gone out, and the Pope has hopefully started a dialogue just with all his speaking. But my question is, what can we expect will happen? The letter goes out, does that encourage a dialogue in smaller areas? What kind of action can we expect from this?
Okay, let's start at the bigger picture, I think might be a good way. Immediately, you have to kind of understand why this particular encyclical came out at this particular time. In December in Paris, there's going to be what is called a meeting called COP21. COP means the Conference of Parties. And the Conference of Parties refers to a 1994 meeting in Brazil about climate change and the environment. This has been sponsored by the UN every year. And at the end of every year, there is a meeting by the members of the parties involved in this. So it's a conference of parties. And the number 21 fooled me at first. I said, oh, 21st century. No. If it has happened every year since 1994, let's try your math. We're now in 2015. This is the 21st meeting of the Council of Parties. This is huge. This is immense. 25,000 delegates are going to be in Paris for this, plus 25,000 other attendees from different organizations around the globe. And so first of all, this encyclical comes out at this time, hoping to be able to insert itself into the dialogue that is going to be taking place. Remember, one of the dialogues that Francis called for is this dialogue on the international level. Without that, nothing can be done. But moving down the scale, okay, the desire is, well, Cardinal Turkson in his speech at Boston College last week, he was the one who mentioned that here we are in Boston. Boston has a great example of what he would call, okay, the sharing integrated ecology. It's called, I don't know if you've ever been to Boston, but Boston Common. A big park in the middle of the city that opened up as a grazing ground for people's cattle. And it went along beautifully for a time until the moneyed interests started bringing in more cattle than they really needed. And gradually what was taken up away from the common people was the common home that they had for their cattle. And so Turkson points that out. And he says, what we need, okay, are seminars like this to take place in universities. One of the sad things that has, that I'm going to have to go talk to my pastor. I haven't heard a word about Laudato Si since it came out in church. Okay? So you talk about the local level. We got to start talking there too. Because Francis says there is this local policy level where we can get involved on things. And so the encouragement is given. Now, whether people pick up on this, a lot depends upon how they feel about this whole issue. I'm hopeful. I think the Pope is hopeful that something is going to take place. But it has to be on many levels.
Yes, sir. A candidate for the presidency who is a member of a party that shall go nameless so as not to appear partisan, but a party nevertheless which scarcely ever acknowledges that climate change is a reality, advised members of a town hall meeting recently that we should not worship the environment and we should do what we can so long as it doesn't threaten jobs and the economy. And I wonder if you could shed some light on how the Pope's encyclical would help people sort that out.
Well, I don't know to whom you are referring, but I can mention two names, people of my own church, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, are climate change skeptics. And they have said things like, the Pope really shouldn't be talking about things like this. This is too political. You're politicizing an issue, or this is a political issue. The spiritual people shouldn't be talking about this. That was, and basically Marco Rubio takes the same position that you mentioned, that if it's going to hurt the economy, we can't afford it. Okay, so let's not talk about it. Jeb Bush says that, he respects the Pope and he gets a lot of his sense of morality from the church, but when it comes to political matters, the Pope should stay out of it. In other words, it's sort of like, I think, in the question of political science, since President Kennedy gave that speech in Houston many, many years ago, in which he said he's going to distance himself from the faith and that, I think we've grown out of that. And many people still are there, though. I think that many people think that, this is the way it should be, an absolute, complete. Why are we here? Separation between church and state. I don't think you're here because you believe that. I think you're here because you feel that faith has something to offer to the common good. And that's what we're all about, is the common good. And so, I don't believe that. As I said, God is always personal, but never private.
Bill, over here.
Yes.
I rejoice that I think the Pope has come up with a unified theory of what it is to be really human. I applaud many, many things, including his interfaith dialogue and his saying that politics and economics are part of being human. And I love, and I want to always say amen when he's talking about capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a difficult issue because our culture is built on capitalism, mm-hmm. and we extend it throughout the world. What do you think is going to be the follow-up from maybe some economists who will step forward and start talking about this? There are a few, but what do you think might come from that?
Okay. First of all, there will probably be a little bit of a more of a nuanced approach to this. The Encyclical never says that capitalism is the basic problem. It says that an unfettered, egoistical capitalism is what's the problem. And it's the unfettered, the one that says there are no limits, and the egotistical capitalism that comes from inside the human being. That's what needs to change. That's where things need to be worked out. As you said, the anthropology that comes forth in this encyclical, talking about what it is to be a human being, the greatness that it is, because we are creatures of God. There's a wonderful aspect of being human, but if we leave out if we leave out our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, and our relationship with the earth, we leave one of those out, it's not integral. We're not being who we are, and that's what he's asking for us, to let the best part of who we are come forth in this issue.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hi.
Hello. In looking at the situation, I think the root cause is the ongoing distrust on the part of the religious community in the scientific community, which is where all this is coming from when it pertains to climate change. And I'm encouraged by listening to the Pope when he's I think trying to build bridges and trying to build some trust between that. But you have a large group of people in the United States. I myself grew up evangelical. You have roughly 50 million people that in many cases distrust the scientific community and feel like they have an agenda of sorts. What can we do? What can the Pope do? What can the religious community in general do to try to continue to build that bridge, build some trust that there is not a secret agenda on the part of the scientific community, but that we can work together to solve some of these common problems?
No, it's an extremely pointed question because it fits in here. Let me just make a couple of, I see somebody reacting. I'll just make a couple of points and let somebody else join in that discussion. But one of the first point I'll make is that one of the dialogues that Pope Francis was calling for is a dialogue between religions and science. Well, this one's been going on since Galileo and before, but I think we have some new insights from the religious point of view that can illuminate some of these problems and maybe help people be less afraid of the scientific approach, because it's for real. I would say that a good part of the evangelical population in the United States, is somewhat skeptical of science to some degree, some more than others. Some have, worked that through, and they're very comfortable with science as part of the reality that surrounds them. So that's the first thing. The Pope is asking for this dialogue to take place. Okay. Secondly, the question of technology again, and the question of the unfettered consumerism comes back into play here. He's not condemning technology in itself. Okay, he's not condemning the idea that we can be prosperous human beings. Okay, and he just says, let us all be prosperous human beings, not just some of us. Okay, and let's not use technology to, grab all the stuff for ourselves and leave the others at a loss for seeking their own common good. But you have a good point. I don't have the answer for that one, but I think the Pope encourages this dialogue between faith and science and religions and science. Was there somebody else who wanted to come in on that issue? Okay.
I just wanted to comment about, so far today we've talked about the need for sacrifice and the importance of understanding limits, and you heard the comment about politicians bringing up that we should work with our environment unless it hurts jobs or unless it hurts the economy. And all I wanted to say is that I've been trained as an engineer, I've been studying climate change for a while and the solutions for climate change. There really is no reason to believe that addressing climate change will hurt our economy or cost jobs. In fact, quite the opposite is true. There will be changes in our economy, but in the end we'll have more jobs and a cleaner environment if we address climate change. So politicians that say we have to choose between jobs and the environment, it's a false choice. It's not correct. Think about our own state. We don't mine any coal in Iowa. We don't produce any oil in Iowa. And yet, Iowa politicians are not supporting climate change because they're afraid it will hurt our economy. Iowa is blessed with wind for electrical energy. We have only exploited 1/50th of the amount of wind we could exploit in Iowa. If we exploited all the wind, the gross domestic product of our state would be double of what it is now. So we're burning coal that we import from other states. We could be using electricity from wind that's right here in Iowa. We could be driving on electricity that's produced right here in Iowa. I drove here today on an electric car, and it's powered by solar panels on my property is south of Cedar Rapids. So please don't pay attention to those false choices that politicians tell you. You have to choose between jobs and the environment. It's not correct at all. You can have a nice, clean environment and a really good, strong economy, too.
Just one comment on that. At the end of Francis's talk to Congress last week, okay, if you look at the last paragraph, you get a hold of that talk, okay, he is encouraging American engineers and scientists to do their part in the solution, which obviously is not get away from this, not give up your jobs or anything like that, but work to bring this about. And so it's not an anti-technological stance. It's the anti-anthropocentrism that seems to be dominating our society that is the issue that he wants to face.
Won't you help me thank Bill, please?
Thank you.